It is 6:47 on a Thursday morning in October 1919, and you are standing in the private quarters of the White House. The most powerful man on earth has just collapsed on the bathroom floor, his left side completely dead. His wife drags him back to bed. She telephones the doctor, and then she does something no American woman has ever done before and no American law ever imagined. She locks the door. For the next 17 months, not a single cabinet member, not the vice president, not one United States senator will enter that room without her permission. Every document, every diplomatic cable, every act of government will pass through her hands first. She has no title, no authority, no mandate. She has something better. She has the key. Chapter 1. The Widow Who Out-Earned the Senators. Before she ever set foot in the White House, Edith Bowling Galt had already done what most women of her era were told was impossible. She ran a business, paid off a dead man's debts, and answered to no one. She was born on October 15, 1872, in the town of Wytheville, Virginia, the seventh of 11 children in a family that had once been wealthy and was no longer. Her father, William Holcomb Bowling, was a circuit court judge who carried himself with the dignity of old Southern lineage and the bank account of a man who had lost everything in the Civil War. The Bowlings traced their ancestry to Pocahontas and John Rolfe, a connection Edith would reference for the rest of her life. It gave her a sense of origin that money could not buy. It also papered over a childhood defined by genteel poverty. Judge Bowling believed in education for his sons. His daughters were a different matter. In the 1880s, in the rural hollows of Southwest Virginia, educating a girl beyond basic literacy was considered not just unnecessary, but faintly suspicious. Edith received her lessons at home, learned to read from her grandmother, and was sent at 15 to Martha Washington College in Abingdon. She lasted 1 year. She transferred to a smaller school in Richmond. She lasted 1 more. 2 semesters of formal education. That was the sum total of the academic preparation of the woman who would one day decide the fate of the League of Nations. What Edith lacked in schooling, she compensated for in observation. She watched her father manage a courtroom. She watched her mother manage 11 children on a threadbare budget. She learned how to read people, how to listen, and how to wait. These are not the skills they teach at finishing school. They are the skills that build empires. In 1896, at 24, she married Norman Galt, a prosperous jeweler who owned Galt and Brothers, one of the oldest and most respected firms in Washington. The store sat on Pennsylvania Avenue, within sight of the White House. For 12 years, Edith lived the comfortable life of a merchant's wife. She traveled to Europe. She attended the theater. She dressed beautifully, and she paid attention to every detail of how her husband ran his business. Norman Galt died in 1908, leaving Edith a 35-year-old widow with a business she had never formally managed and debts she had never been told about. In 1908, a widow's expected course of action was to sell, to remarry, or to hand control to a male relative. Edith did none of these things. She hired a manager named Henry Christian Bergheimer to handle daily operations, but she retained full ownership. She reviewed the books. She approved the purchases. She made the decisions. Within 2 years, she had paid off Norman's debts. Within 5, the business was profitable and growing. By 1913, Edith Bowling Galt was one of the wealthiest independent women in Washington, earning more annually than most members of the United States Senate, whose salary at the time was $7,500 a year. She owned her home outright. She owned an electric car, one of the first women in the city to drive one. She answered to no husband, no father, no board, and no bank. The Washington that Edith inhabited in those years was a city of elaborate social hierarchies and ruthless gatekeeping. Who you knew determined where you dined, and where you dined determined what you knew. Edith moved through this world with the confidence of a woman who had earned her own money and owed no favors. She was charming without being needy. She was intelligent without being threatening. She was, in the language of the era, a woman of quality. None of this would have mattered if she had not, on a March afternoon in 1915, been invited to tea at the White House by her friend Helen Bones, the president's cousin. She arrived in muddy boots, having just come from a walk. The president, still raw with grief over his first wife's death, saw her in the hallway and was immediately captivated. But that meeting is the next chapter. What matters here is the woman who walked through that door. Not a socialite, not an heiress, not a political spouse groomed for public life. A self-made businesswoman with 2 semesters of schooling, a paid-off mortgage, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that she could manage anything put in front of her. The question no one thought to ask in March of 1915 was what would happen if the thing put in front of her was the presidency of the United States. Chapter 2. The President Who Could Not Be Alone. Woodrow Wilson was the most intellectually formidable president of his generation, and he could not function without a woman beside him. This is not speculation. This is a pattern documented across 40 years of his adult life. Wilson was a man of enormous mental discipline who published 9 books, governed a university, won a governorship, and reshaped the American presidency. He was also a man who fell into paralyzing depressions when left emotionally untethered. His first wife, Ellen Axon Wilson, had been his anchor for 29 years. She managed his moods, filtered his social world, soothed his rages, and created the domestic structure within which his intellect could operate. When Ellen died of Bright's disease on August 6, 1914, 5 months into the First World War, Wilson told his physician, Cary Grayson, that he wished someone would assassinate him. He was not speaking loosely. Wilson stopped eating. He wandered the White House corridors at night. He wept openly in front of staff. The most powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere was being led by a man who could barely get through the day. His advisors were terrified. His closest friend, Colonel Edward House, began managing the most sensitive diplomatic communications because the president was too grief-stricken to focus. Into this vacuum walked Edith Bowling Galt. Their courtship, beginning in March 1915, was among the fastest in presidential history. Wilson proposed in May, barely 2 months after their first meeting, and only 9 months after Ellen's death. His political advisors were horrified. Secretary of the Treasury William McAdoo, who was also Wilson's son-in-law, warned that a hasty remarriage would destroy the president's re-election chances. The story goes that Wilson's advisors fabricated a scandal, inventing a rumor about a past Wilson love affair, hoping Edith would be repelled and break off the engagement. It did not work. Edith saw through the deception. She stayed. They married on December 18, 1915, in a small ceremony at Edith's home on 20th Street. Within weeks, Edith Wilson began doing something no First Lady had done before. She sat beside the president during briefings. She read classified documents at his desk. Wilson gave her access to the wartime diplomatic code so she could help him decode messages from American ambassadors in Europe. She decoded cables while he ate breakfast. Let that fact settle. In 1916, with American neutrality hanging by a thread and German submarines sinking Allied shipping across the Atlantic, the wartime codes of the United States were being handled by a woman with no security clearance, no government title, and no authority beyond the affection of her husband. No one in the military chain of command authorized this. No one in the State Department approved it. Wilson simply handed her the code because he trusted her more than he trusted his own cabinet. This was not a woman being decorative. This was a woman being integrated into the machinery of presidential decision-making at the highest level. She attended meetings, she read intelligence, she offered opinions that Wilson solicited and valued. Colonel House, who had been Wilson's most trusted confidant, found himself increasingly shut out. Edith did not like House. She found him manipulative. She told Wilson so. By 1918, House's influence had been dramatically curtailed. The most powerful advisor in the Wilson White House had been neutralized by the president's wife. The public saw none of this. The public saw a devoted couple, a romantic wartime presidency, a dignified first lady who supported her husband. The newspapers printed photographs of Edith christening ships and visiting wounded soldiers. Behind the cameras, she was reading every document that crossed the president's desk, shaping which visitors gained access, and steadily building the role of gatekeeper that would become the most consequential position in American government when the stroke arrived. Wilson's dependency on Edith was not merely emotional, it was operational. He dictated letters to her. He tested speeches on her. He relied on her memory, which was formidable, to recall details of meetings and conversations. By 1918, the Wilson White House functioned as a two-person operation, and only one of those people had been elected. What no one recognized at the time, because no one was looking, was that the infrastructure for Edith's later seizure of power was already fully built. The access was established. The gatekeeper role was normalized. The cabinet and staff were already accustomed to going through Edith to reach the president. When the crisis came, she did not need to build a new system. She simply locked the door on the one that already existed. Chapter 3. The Four Strokes Nobody Told You About. The October 1919 stroke was not the first time Woodrow Wilson's brain tried to kill him, and it was not the first time his doctors lied about it. The medical history of Woodrow Wilson reads like a slow-motion catastrophe that everyone around him chose to ignore. He suffered his first significant cerebrovascular episode in 1906 while serving as president of Princeton University. He woke one morning to find himself blind in his left eye. His personal physician diagnosed a blood clot in the retinal artery, a condition caused by severe hypertension and a clear warning sign of vascular disease. Wilson was 50 years old. The doctor told him to rest. Wilson told the doctor he was fine. No public announcement was made. Over the next decade, Wilson experienced repeated episodes, headaches so severe he could not work, periods of unexplained weakness, sudden changes in personality that his associates attributed to stubbornness, but that modern neurologists recognize as signs of progressive cerebrovascular damage. In 1913, during his first year as president, he had episodes of numbness in his hands. His handwriting deteriorated. Dr. Cary Grayson, the White House physician who would become the most important co-conspirator in Edith's later deception, noted these symptoms and said nothing publicly. Grayson was a Navy doctor who had been assigned to the White House during the Taft administration, and who Wilson retained because he liked his company. He was charming, loyal, and discreet. He was also the man who established the fundamental pattern that would make the 1919 cover-up possible. When the president's health deteriorated, the doctor's job was not to inform the public, but to protect the president from the public. In April 1919, During the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson collapsed again. He developed a sudden fever of 103 degrees, severe coughing, and what witnesses described as confusion and paranoia. Grayson told the press the president had a cold. Modern historians, including Dr. Edwin Weinstein, who published a definitive medical biography in 1981, believe Wilson suffered a significant stroke in Paris, one that damaged the blood vessels on the right side of his brain and produced measurable changes in his judgment and behavior. The Paris episode is critical to understanding everything that followed. Before April 1919, Wilson was a difficult but functional negotiator. He had arrived at the peace conference with a clear plan. His 14 points, a vision for a new international order built on collective security, open diplomacy, and the self-determination of peoples. He bargained hard. He compromised strategically. He was capable of reading the room and adjusting. After the April collapse, those who worked with him daily noticed a change. He became more rigid. He grew suspicious of allies. He fixated on trivial details while losing sight of larger strategic questions. The man who returned from Paris in July 1919 was not the same man who had arrived in December 1918. His brain was deteriorating, and the only person in a position to insist on a full medical evaluation was the one person whose career depended on never demanding one, Cary Grayson. By September 1919, Wilson was exhausted, hypertensive, and showing clear signs of vascular fragility. It was at precisely this moment that he decided to take the fight for the League of Nations directly to the American people. Over the objections of Edith, who could see what the schedule was doing to his body, and over the private concerns of Grayson, who knew what the medical reality was, Wilson boarded a special train for a cross-country speaking tour. 29 cities in 22 days, 8,000 miles of travel, multiple speeches per day in the era before amplification, meaning Wilson had to shout to be heard by crowds of 10 and 15,000 people. On September 25th, after a speech in Pueblo, Colorado, Wilson collapsed in his private rail car. Grayson found him with the left side of his face drooping and tears streaming down his cheeks. The train turned around and raced back to Washington. Grayson told reporters the president was suffering from nervous exhaustion. 7 days later, on the morning of October 2nd, Edith found her husband on the bathroom floor of the White House, unconscious, the left side of his body paralyzed. She lifted him, she dragged him to the bed, she called Grayson, and then she locked the door. The infrastructure for what happened next had been built across 13 years of medical deception. Grayson knew how to lie to the press. Edith knew how to control access. Wilson's staff knew how to follow orders without asking questions. The only thing that had changed was the scale of the lie. Before October 2nd, they had concealed a president's declining health. After October 2nd, they would conceal the fact that the President of the United States was no longer capable of governing. Chapter 4. The morning America lost its president. At some point between 6 and 7 on the morning of October 2nd, 1919, the presidency of the United States effectively ended, and a new, unnamed, unconstitutional government began. The precise sequence of events in the White House that morning has been reconstructed from the memoirs of Edith Wilson, the diary of White House Chief Usher Ike Hoover, and the later testimony of Dr. Grayson. The accounts do not always agree, which tells you something about what was already being managed. What is not disputed. Edith went to check on Woodrow early that morning and found him on the tile floor of their shared bathroom. He was conscious but unable to move his left side. His left arm was useless. His left leg could not bear weight. The left side of his face had collapsed. He may or may not have been able to speak. Edith, who was 47 years old and strong enough to have once driven a horse and buggy through the mountains of Virginia, somehow got him off the floor and back into the bed. She called Grayson. The doctor arrived within minutes and conducted an examination that confirmed what both of them already knew. The president had suffered a massive thrombosis in the right middle cerebral artery. The damage was catastrophic. Wilson could not sit up. He could barely swallow. His left visual field was gone. The mental faculties that remained were fragmentary, drifting in and out of coherence. Grayson then called a specialist, Dr. Francis Dercum, a neurologist from Philadelphia who arrived later that day. Dercum examined the president and delivered a judgment that would shape the next 17 months of American governance. He told Edith and Grayson that Wilson's mind was clear, that he was capable of recovery, and that the worst possible course of action would be to force his resignation, which would, in Dercum's view, destroy his will to live. Whether Dercum genuinely believed this, or whether he was telling a desperate wife what she needed to hear, has been debated by historians for a century. What matters is what happened next. Edith asked Dercum directly, what should she do? And Dercum gave her the answer that unlocked everything. He said that she should screen all matters of state and decide what was important enough to bring to the president's attention. A neurologist had just handed the executive branch of the United States government to the president's wife. He had no authority to do this. There was no constitutional provision for it. There was no law that permitted it, and no precedent that supported it. But in the absence of any mechanism to transfer power, in the silence of a constitution that had never imagined this scenario, a doctor's bedside recommendation became the operating framework for the American presidency. The door was locked. It would stay locked. The first person to realize something was profoundly wrong was Ike Hoover, the chief usher who had served in the White House since the Harrison administration. Hoover arrived that morning to find the family quarters sealed. No staff were admitted. No messages were accepted. When cabinet members called, they were told the president was resting. When reporters asked questions, Grayson issued a statement that was a masterwork of technical truth and functional deception. He said the president was suffering from nervous exhaustion and required rest. Every word was technically accurate. The impression it created was a lie. Consider what the United States government looked like on the morning of October 3, 1919. 28 treaties awaited Senate action. The Treaty of Versailles, containing the Covenant of the League of Nations, was in the middle of the most consequential ratification fight in American history. The country was convulsing with labor strikes. Over 4 million workers would walk off their jobs that autumn. The steel strike alone involved 365,000 workers across 50 cities. Race riots had torn through 24 American cities during the Red Summer. The Volstead Act, which would enforce prohibition, was sitting on the president's desk awaiting either signature or veto. The nation was demobilizing from the largest war in human history, and 2 million soldiers were still in the process of returning home. All of this required presidential action. Appointments needed to be made. Legislation needed to be signed or vetoed. Diplomatic cables needed responses. Executive orders needed authorization. And the man constitutionally empowered to do all of these things was lying in a darkened bedroom, unable to lift his left arm, drifting between consciousness and confusion, accessible to no one except his wife and his doctor. For the first 4 days after the stroke, no member of the cabinet saw the president. no communication was issued in his name. The government of the United States simply stopped. Secretary of State Robert Lansing convened a meeting on October 6th to discuss the crisis, and one of the questions he raised was whether the cabinet should invoke the constitutional provision for presidential disability. The Constitution stated that in the case of the president's inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, those powers would devolve to the vice president. But the Constitution did not define inability. It did not specify who had the authority to declare it. It did not establish a process. This was the flaw. This was the crack in the foundation that Edith Wilson stepped through. There was no mechanism. There was only a locked door, a loyal doctor, and a wife who had decided that the presidency would survive on her terms or not at all. Vice President Thomas Marshall, a gentle, self-deprecating man who once said that what this country needed was a good 5-cent cigar, was terrified of the presidency and made no move to claim it. Lansing's constitutional question went nowhere. The cabinet, lacking any authority to act, deferred. The senators, lacking any information, waited. And behind the locked door, Edith Wilson began to govern. Chapter 5. The woman the cabinet feared most. Within a week of the stroke, every member of Woodrow Wilson's cabinet understood a new and terrifying political reality. The person who would decide their fate was not the president. The system Edith built was elegant in its simplicity. Each morning, she collected the documents, memoranda, and correspondence that had been delivered to the White House overnight. She read them at a desk outside the president's bedroom. She sorted them into categories: matters she considered urgent, matters she considered unimportant, and matters she would handle herself. For the items she deemed worthy of presidential attention, she carried them into the bedroom, summarized them for Wilson, and emerged with instructions written in her own handwriting on scraps of paper. Those scraps of paper became the most powerful unsigned documents in American history. They typically began with the phrase, "the president says," or "the president directs," followed by a decision, an appointment, or an instruction. No one outside that bedroom could verify whether Wilson had actually said what Edith claimed he had said. No one could confirm that the president understood the question that had been put to him. No one could establish that the decision represented Wilson's judgment rather than Edith's. The scraps of paper were accepted as presidential directives because there was no alternative. To challenge them was to challenge the presidency itself, and no one in the Wilson administration was prepared to do that. The morning routine was only part of the system. Edith also controlled access. Cabinet members who requested meetings with the president were told he was too ill. Senators who demanded audiences were turned away. Foreign ambassadors who sought consultations were informed that the president was recovering and would see them in due time. The only people who entered the bedroom with any regularity were Edith, Grayson, and a small number of nurses who were sworn to secrecy. The information environment was total. Edith decided what Wilson heard about the outside world. She decided which newspapers reached him. She decided which summaries of Senate debates were read to him. She decided which advisors' memoranda were placed before him and which were quietly set aside. In the modern language of intelligence, she was not merely a gatekeeper. She was a filter, an editor, and an analyst, the single point through which all information flowed in both directions. Consider the power this represented. The President of the United States could not act on information he did not receive. He could not respond to arguments he never heard. He could not compromise with opponents whose positions were never accurately conveyed to him. By controlling information, Edith controlled outcomes. This was not shadow governance in the metaphorical sense. This was the actual mechanics of how the executive branch functioned for 17 months. On October 6th, 4 days after the stroke, Secretary of State Robert Lansing convened the cabinet and raised the question of presidential disability. When Grayson appeared before the assembled secretaries, Lansing asked directly whether the president was capable of performing his duties. Grayson refused to answer clearly. He said the president's mind was not only clear, but very active, while simultaneously refusing to allow any cabinet member to see him. Edith learned of Lansing's initiative almost immediately, and she marked him. In her later memoir, she described Lansing's action as an attempt to oust her husband. She did not forget. On October 27th, 25 days after the stroke, the Volstead Act arrived at the White House, requiring the president's action. The act, which provided the enforcement mechanism for the 18th Amendment and the dawn of Prohibition, had passed both houses of Congress with veto-proof majorities. Someone in the White House returned the bill with a veto message. The veto was overridden the same day. The question of who wrote that veto message has never been definitively answered. Wilson was, at that point, barely able to sit up in bed. He could not hold a pen steadily. He could not read a long document. The veto message was lucid and well argued. Historians have noted that its reasoning closely tracked the legal analysis that had been prepared by administration lawyers and delivered to Edith. Whether Wilson dictated it, whether Edith composed it from staff materials, or whether someone else drafted it and Edith presented it as presidential action, remains one of the unresolved questions of the stewardship period. This is the point that must be understood clearly. For 17 months, the daily operations of the American executive branch were managed by a woman who had completed 2 semesters of formal education, who held no government position, who had taken no oath of office, and who was accountable to no one. She did not serve at the pleasure of Congress. She could not be impeached. She could not be voted out. She could not be subpoenaed. She existed in a constitutional void, exercising power that no document authorized and no institution could check. Edith later described her role as a stewardship. She insisted she made no decisions herself, but merely determined which matters required presidential attention and which could wait. The historical record does not support this characterization. She fired the Secretary of State. She blocked diplomatic meetings. She decided the fate of legislation. She chose which senators could visit and which could not. To call this stewardship is to define a word so narrowly that it loses all meaning. What Edith Wilson conducted from behind that locked door was an unelected, unaccountable, unconstitutional administration. And it worked, not because it was legitimate, but because no one had the power or the will to stop it. Chapter 6. The Performance That Fooled the Senate. On December 5th, 1919, 2 United States senators walked into the White House to determine whether the president was alive and competent, and they walked out having been deceived by a blanket, a shadow, and a dying man's charm. By late November, the rumors had become uncontrollable. Washington was awash in whispered speculation. Some said the president was dead and that Edith was signing documents in his name. Others said he had lost his mind entirely and was being held prisoner. Senator George Moses of New Hampshire told reporters that Wilson had suffered a brain lesion and was mentally incompetent. The Senate, facing the most important treaty vote in a generation, was being asked to accept presidential guidance from scraps of paper delivered by a woman no one could question. The pressure for verification had become a political crisis of its own. Senator Albert Fall of New Mexico a Republican who despised Wilson and would later go to prison for his role in the Teapot Dome scandal, partnered with Senator Gilbert Hitchcock of Nebraska, a Democrat and Wilson's Senate floor leader, to conduct a presidential visit. The stated purpose was to discuss the crisis in Mexico, where American consular agent William Jenkins had been detained. The actual purpose was to determine whether Woodrow Wilson was capable of serving as President of the United States. The staging that preceded this visit was the most elaborate political theater of the Wilson presidency, and it was directed entirely by Edith. She controlled every variable. The visit would take place in the bedroom, not the Oval Office, establishing the setting as medical rather than governmental. Wilson would be positioned in bed, propped up on pillows, with the blankets arranged so that his paralyzed left side was completely hidden. The room would be dimly lit, with the curtains adjusted to keep Wilson's face partially in shadow, concealing the droop on the left side that betrayed the stroke's damage. A stack of papers and documents would be placed on the bedside table, creating the impression of a working president reviewing matters of state. Wilson was shaved that morning for the first time in weeks. His hair was combed. Edith rehearsed with him. She placed critical documents about the Jenkins case within his reach so that he could reference specific details during the conversation, demonstrating command of current events. She positioned herself in the room as a watchful but unobtrusive presence, ready to intervene if the conversation drifted into territory Wilson could not navigate. The senators were escorted in. What happened next lasted approximately 45 minutes and constituted one of the most consequential acts of political deception in American history. Wilson was, by all accounts, extraordinary. Drawing on reserves of willpower that even his doctors found remarkable, he engaged Fall and Hitchcock in detailed conversation about the Jenkins case. He cracked jokes. He quoted facts from memory. He appeared to two men who had not seen him in 2 months and who were observing him in a dim room from a carefully controlled angle to be a sick but functioning president. Senator Fall, upon leaving, made a statement that historians have puzzled over for a century. He told reporters that Wilson had gripped his hand and that the president's handshake was firm and warm. This is notable because Wilson's left hand was paralyzed and his right hand had limited function. Whether Fall shook a hand that could barely grip, whether Wilson used his less damaged right hand, or whether Fall simply invented a detail to serve his own political purposes, remains unclear. What is clear is that Fall walked out of that room and told the press that the president was alert, oriented, and capable. Hitchcock corroborated. The Democratic senator reported that Wilson was in good spirits, mentally sharp, and recovering. The investigation into presidential disability evaporated. The Senate moved on. The pressure for invoking the succession clause disappeared. Edith had won. She had taken a man who could not walk, could not dress himself, could barely see, and whose left side was dead weight, and she had presented him to the United States Senate as a functioning president. The performance bought her months. It silenced the most dangerous threat to her stewardship, and it ensured that no further serious attempt to remove Wilson from office would be made for the remainder of his term. The cost of this victory would become apparent in the weeks that followed. Because the Senate now believed the president was competent, they also believed his positions on the treaty were genuinely his own. When Wilson's instructions from behind the locked door demanded absolute rigidity on the League of Nations, refusing any of Henry Cabot Lodge's reservations, the senators accepted this as the considered judgment of a functioning president. They did not know, because Edith's staging had ensured they could not know, that the man issuing those instructions could barely follow a complex argument, that his information was filtered through a single person, and that his judgment had been fundamentally altered by a brain that was destroying itself from the inside. The performance that saved the Wilson presidency in December may have killed the League of Nations in March. The deception that fooled the Senate also trapped it. And the question that hung over every subsequent event was no longer whether Edith could hold power. It was what that power would cost the world. Chapter 7. The Treaty That Died in Her Hands. The League of Nations was Woodrow Wilson's masterpiece, and his wife's stewardship may have been the thing that killed it. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, you have to understand what the League represented. Wilson had sailed to Europe in December 1918 with a vision that no American president had ever attempted: a permanent international body that would resolve disputes through collective security rather than war. The League of Nations was to be the architecture of a new world. 42 nations had agreed to join. The covenant of the League was written into the Treaty of Versailles itself, binding the peace settlement to the new international order. Wilson staked his presidency, his health, and ultimately his life on the belief that the United States would lead this organization. The opposition was led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and Wilson's oldest political enemy. Lodge was brilliant, patrician, and patient. He did not oppose the League outright. That would have been too simple and too unpopular. Instead, he attached 14 reservations to the treaty, conditions that he said were necessary to protect American sovereignty. The most critical reservation concerned Article 10, which committed League members to defend each other against aggression. Lodge wanted language making clear that the United States would not go to war without the explicit consent of Congress. Modern historians broadly agree that Lodge's reservations were negotiable. Many moderate Republicans were prepared to vote for the treaty with reservations attached. Even some of Wilson's closest allies believed that a compromise treaty was vastly preferable to no treaty at all. The question was whether Wilson would bend. Before the stroke, Wilson had shown some willingness to negotiate. He had met with senators. He had discussed possible compromises. He was stubborn, but not suicidal. After the stroke, this changed. In November 1919, Senator Hitchcock visited Wilson twice to discuss the treaty. Both visits were arranged and mediated by Edith. In the first meeting, Hitchcock presented the political reality. Without some acceptance of Lodge's reservations, the treaty would fail. Wilson appeared to grasp this. He discussed possible compromises. Hitchcock left with cautious optimism. Between the first visit and the second, something shifted. Whether Edith conveyed Hitchcock's arguments accurately, whether Wilson's damaged brain could retain complex political reasoning from one day to the next, whether Edith herself influenced his position, we cannot say with certainty. What we know is that at the second meeting, Wilson was rigid. He instructed Hitchcock to hold the line, no reservations, no compromise. He reportedly told Hitchcock that the senators would have to accept the treaty as written. Edith later wrote in her memoir that she urged Wilson to accept the reservations. She claimed she told him that half a loaf was better than none. But this self-serving account was published 20 years after the fact, at a time when the consequences of the treaty's failure were catastrophically clear. Her actions in real time tell a different story. She controlled who saw Wilson. She controlled what information reached him. She controlled the environment in which every decision was made. And the decision that emerged from behind that locked door was the decision that killed the League. On November 19, 1919, the Senate voted twice. First, on the treaty with Lodge's reservations. Wilson had instructed his Democratic allies to vote no, and they did. The resolution failed, 39 to 55. Then the Senate voted on the treaty without reservations. That also failed, 38 to 53. In a single evening, both versions of the Treaty of Versailles went down to defeat. The treaty was revived for a final vote on March 19, 1920. This time, 21 Democrats broke with Wilson and voted for the treaty with reservations. It was not enough. The final tally was 49 in favor, 35 against, 7 votes short of the two-thirds majority required for ratification. The treaty was dead. The League of Nations would proceed without the country that had conceived it. The consequences cascaded across the 20th century. Without American participation, the League lacked the economic and military power to enforce its decisions. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League condemned the action and Japan simply withdrew from the organization. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League imposed sanctions too weak to matter. When Germany began its march across Europe, there was no collective security framework capable of stopping it. 20 years after Wilson collapsed on the bathroom floor of the White House, 50 million people would die in the war that the League was supposed to prevent. It is impossible to draw a straight line from Edith's locked door to the beaches of Normandy. History is not that simple. But it is equally impossible to ignore the chain of causation. A compromise treaty might have brought America into the League. An American-backed League might have deterred aggression. A world with a functioning collective security system might have avoided the deadliest conflict in human history. And the hinge on which all of this turned was a bedroom in the White House, where a woman with no mandate and no accountability decided what her husband would hear and what he would not. Chapter 8. The Secretary of State she destroyed. Robert Lansing committed one unforgivable sin. He tried to do his job, and for that, the First Lady of the United States had him fired. Lansing was not a sympathetic figure. He was cold, legalistic, and lacking in political charm. He had been appointed Secretary of State in 1915 after William Jennings Bryan resigned over Wilson's increasingly aggressive response to German submarine warfare. Lansing was a competent international lawyer, a cautious diplomat, and a man who understood the limits of his own authority. He was also the only senior member of the Wilson administration who attempted a constitutional response to the worst constitutional crisis since the Civil War. On October 6, 1919, 4 days after the stroke, Lansing convened the cabinet and raised the question that everyone else was afraid to ask. The Constitution, he noted, provided for the transfer of presidential powers in the event of presidential inability. Should the cabinet formally discuss whether that threshold had been reached? The question was legitimate. The concern was genuine. The constitutional basis was sound. And the reaction from the White House was instant and lethal. Grayson appeared before the cabinet and delivered a performance designed to make Lansing's question seem premature. The president's mind was clear, Grayson assured them. Recovery was expected. Any move to transfer power would be devastating to the president's health. Behind the scenes, Edith received a full report on Lansing's initiative and filed it away with the precision of a woman who understood that power is as much about memory as it is about action. Lansing did not stop. Over the following weeks and months, he continued to convene cabinet meetings without presidential authorization, a practice that had no clear constitutional prohibition, but that Edith interpreted as a direct challenge to her authority. She was not wrong about the implication. If the cabinet could meet without the president, it could function without the president. and if it could function without the president, it did not need Edith. Between October 1919 and January 1920, Lansing held approximately 25 unauthorized cabinet meetings. He coordinated government responses to the steel strike, the coal strike, and the Red Scare deportations. He managed diplomatic communications. He kept the machinery of government grinding forward in the absence of presidential leadership. In doing so, he may have prevented a complete administrative collapse. He also signed his own professional death warrant. Edith waited. This is important. She did not strike immediately. She watched Lansing for 4 months, cataloging his offenses, building her case, waiting for the political moment when his removal would generate minimum resistance. This was not the behavior of a grieving wife, overwhelmed by circumstance. This was the behavior of a political operator with a strategist's instinct for timing. On February 7th, 1920, Edith made her move. A letter was sent to Lansing, signed by Wilson, but almost certainly composed by Edith or at her direction, demanding an explanation for his assumption of presidential authority in convening cabinet meetings without the president's consent. The letter's tone was icy. Its intent was unmistakable. Lansing wrote a dignified reply defending his actions and tendered his resignation on February 13th. It was immediately accepted. The firing sent a signal that reverberated through every corridor of the executive branch. Lansing had been the most senior member of the cabinet. He had served for nearly 5 years. He had attempted the constitutionally responsible course of action, and he had been destroyed for it. The message to every remaining secretary, every undersecretary, every career official in the administration was absolute. The woman behind the locked door was in charge, and challenging her authority meant the end of your career. The Lansing episode also revealed something about the nature of Edith's power that extended beyond domestic politics. During this same period, the British ambassador, Edward Grey, Viscount Grey of Falodon, was refused access to the president. Grey had been sent to Washington specifically to negotiate the treaty impasse, and his mission was considered critical by the British government. Edith refused to grant him an audience because Grey's secretary, Major Charles Kennedy Crawford Stewart, had allegedly repeated gossip about Wilson. The diplomatic slight was extraordinary. The most important ally of the United States was denied access to the American president because the president's wife held a personal grudge against a junior member of the ambassador's staff. Grey eventually gave up and returned to London without ever meeting Wilson. The British government was baffled. The diplomatic relationship suffered, and the episode illustrated a truth about Edith's governance that no amount of historical revisionism can soften. Her decisions were not always driven by policy judgment. They were sometimes driven by personal loyalty, personal offense, and the personal conviction that she alone understood what was best for her husband, and by extension, for the country. This was the architecture of power that Edith had built, not a cabinet, not an administration, a court. And in a court, the only law that matters is the favor of the ruler. Chapter 9. Petticoat Government and the Suffragist She Despised. Senator Albert Fall called her the Presidentress and shouted from the Senate floor that a woman was running America, and the most extraordinary part is that he was right. The phrase petticoat government appeared in newspaper editorials as early as November 1919. It was not a compliment. It was a weapon drawn from the deepest well of American political anxiety. The fear that a woman was making decisions that only men were constitutionally and biologically equipped to make. Senators who could not prove that Edith was governing could safely imply it, and the implication carried centuries of assumption about female incompetence, emotional instability, and domestic subordination. Fall was the loudest. On the Senate floor, he accused the White House of concealing the president's condition and suggested that the country was being governed by an unelected woman. He demanded a full investigation. He called for Wilson's removal. His rhetoric was blunt, gendered, and in its essential claim, accurate. A woman was governing the United States, but Fall's accusations gained less traction than they should have, partly because the December visit had diffused the crisis, and partly because the accusation itself was so extraordinary that many Americans simply refused to believe it. The press, operating under the norms of early 20th century journalism, was largely deferential. Reporters did not camp outside the White House gates or demand medical records. The concept of the public's right to know about presidential health had not yet been established. Newspapers published Grayson's carefully worded bulletins and moved on. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and the wire services all failed to investigate the most significant constitutional crisis of the era, not because they lacked suspicion, but because the journalistic culture of 1919 provided no framework for challenging a White House on a matter it refused to discuss. But the attacks on Edith as a woman wielding power, however politically motivated, exposed a contradiction so vast that it threatens to swallow her entire legacy. Edith Wilson exercised more executive authority than any American woman had ever held. She controlled the flow of government. She hired and fired officials. She managed the information environment of the most powerful office in the world. She did this at the precise historical moment when millions of American women were fighting for the most basic form of political power, the right to vote. And Edith Wilson was against them. Her opposition to women's suffrage was not passive or private. It was visceral. She called the suffragists who picketed the White House those devils in the workhouse, referring to the women of the National Woman's Party who had been arrested, jailed, and force-fed for the crime of holding banners outside the president's front gate. Alice Paul, the leader of the picketing campaign, had endured hunger strikes and brutal treatment at the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia. Edith's contempt for these women was personal and unrelenting. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution, granting women the right to vote, passed Congress in June 1919 and was sent to the states for ratification. The ratification process continued throughout the period of Edith's stewardship. State after state voted. The outcome hung in the balance. On August 18, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify by a margin of a single vote, cast by a 24-year-old legislator who changed his mind after receiving a letter from his mother. The amendment was certified on August 26, 1920. Edith's contribution to this achievement was precisely zero. She made no public statements supporting ratification. She exerted no pressure on wavering state legislators. She used none of the enormous informal power she held to advance the cause. The most powerful woman in America watched the suffrage movement reach its climax from behind the same locked door where she exercised the very power that the suffragists were demanding, and she did nothing to help them get it. This is the contradiction that no biography of Edith Wilson can resolve. She proved, more dramatically than any suffragist's argument ever could, that a woman was capable of wielding executive power. She proved it under conditions of extreme crisis, with no preparation, no training, and no support beyond a single loyal doctor. She proved it so thoroughly that the government continued to function. Treaties were debated, legislation was vetoed, and officials were fired, all under her direction. And she believed that women should not have the right to vote. How do you hold these two truths in the same hand? One interpretation is that Edith was a product of her class and her region. She was a wealthy white woman from Virginia who had internalized the social hierarchies of her upbringing. The suffragists were radicals. The picketers were unseemly. The movement threatened the social order from which Edith drew her identity. She could exercise power herself because she understood it as a personal obligation to her husband, not as a political right belonging to her gender. Another interpretation is simpler and darker. Edith did not want women to have power. She wanted Edith to have power. The distinction is everything. Whatever the motivation, the collision between Edith's personal authority and her political beliefs represents the most revealing moment in her story. She was not a feminist icon. She was not a pioneer of women's rights. She was a woman who seized power when circumstance demanded it, wielded it with skill and ruthlessness, and refused to extend to any other woman the opportunity she had given herself. The most powerful woman in America believed that women should not have power, and the suffragists won anyway, not because of her, but despite her. Chapter 10: The Clock That Ended Her Presidency. Edith Wilson was not impeached, not removed, not exposed, and not overthrown. She was simply outlasted by the calendar. By the spring of 1920, Wilson had recovered enough to sit in a wheelchair, to receive occasional visitors under controlled conditions, and to issue brief statements. But recovery is a relative term. He was partially blind. He was easily fatigued. He suffered from emotional volatility that left him weeping one moment and raging the next. His left side remained largely paralyzed. He could manage a few hours of limited engagement on his best days. This was not a president capable of governing. It was a president capable of being displayed. And yet Wilson, or what remained of Wilson, had one final act of self-delusion to perform. He wanted a third term. The idea was preposterous. He could barely leave the White House grounds. He could not campaign. He could not give speeches. He could not stand before a crowd. But in the wreckage of his once formidable mind, Wilson convinced himself that the 1920 Democratic Convention would turn to him as the only man capable of saving the League. Edith, who could see clearly what her husband could not, gently and then firmly steered him away from this fantasy, though she never publicly humiliated him by stating the obvious truth. The Democrats nominated James Cox of Ohio. Cox selected a young running mate named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They were crushed in November by Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge in one of the largest landslide victories in American history. Harding won 60.3% of the popular vote and 404 electoral votes. The margin was a repudiation not just of Wilson, but of everything Wilson represented: the League, the internationalism, the moral certitude, the idealism that had driven America onto the world stage. On March 4th, 1921, the Wilsons left the White House for the last time. They moved to a house on S Street in the Embassy Row neighborhood of Washington. Edith's stewardship was over. It had lasted 17 months. No one had stopped it. No one had exposed it. And no one, at the time, fully understood what it had been. Wilson lived for 3 more years, a diminished figure receiving occasional visitors and issuing rare public statements. He died on February 3rd, 1924, at 67. Edith was at his side. His last word, according to her account, was Edith. She spent the next 37 years defending what she had done. In 1939, she published My Memoir, a carefully constructed account that framed her role as passive, supportive, and entirely subordinate to her husband's wishes. She had merely been a steward, she insisted. She had made no decisions. She had simply sorted the mail and relayed her husband's instructions. The book was a masterpiece of strategic understatement, and it established the narrative that would dominate for decades. The devoted wife who shouldered a burden no one else would carry. The historical record, painstakingly assembled by later scholars, tells a different story, but Edith's version held for a generation. She was invited to state dinners. She was consulted by presidents. She was treated with the deference due a former first lady and the quiet unease due a woman who had once held the power they now exercised. Chapter 11. The amendment she made necessary. It took the United States government 47 years to fix the flaw that one woman had exposed in a single morning. The Constitution of the United States, as ratified in 1788 and amended through the early 20th century, contained a gap so dangerous that it is remarkable no one had exploited it before Edith Wilson. Article 2, Section 1 stated that in the event of the President's inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the Vice President. But the clause defined nothing. What constituted inability? Who determined it? Was the transfer permanent or temporary? Could a president who recovered reclaim the office? The silence on these questions was not an oversight. The framers simply had not imagined the scenario that October 2nd, 1919 made real. The Wilson precedent haunted constitutional scholars for decades. President Eisenhower, who suffered a heart attack in September 1955 and a stroke in November 1957, was acutely aware of the danger. He entered into an informal agreement with Vice President Nixon specifying how power would be transferred if the president became incapacitated. Kennedy made a similar arrangement with Lyndon Johnson. These were gentlemen's agreements, legally unenforceable and constitutionally meaningless. They were also an admission that the most powerful government in the world still had no mechanism for handling what Edith Wilson had handled by locking a door. The assassination of President Kennedy on November 22, 1963, created the final impetus for action. Kennedy's death itself was covered by existing constitutional provisions, as Johnson was sworn in within hours. But the assassination raised terrifying hypothetical questions. What if Kennedy had survived in a vegetative state? What if Johnson had also been injured? What if the president and vice president were both incapacitated simultaneously? Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana took up the cause. In the congressional debates over what became the 25th Amendment, the Wilson precedent was cited explicitly and repeatedly. Bayh and his colleagues pointed to the 17 months of shadow government as proof that the Constitution required a formal, enforceable process for handling presidential disability. The question that Lansing had raised in October 1919, the question that Edith had crushed, was finally being answered at the level of constitutional law. The 25th Amendment was ratified on February 10, 1967. Its provisions were precise where the original Constitution had been silent. Section 3 allowed the President to voluntarily transfer power to the Vice President during a period of disability. Section 4 established a mechanism for involuntary transfer. The Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet could declare the President unable to serve, transferring power to the Vice President. If the President contested the declaration, Congress would decide by a 2/3 vote of both chambers. The amendment has been invoked 6 times, most often for routine surgical procedures. It has never been used to remove a president against his will, but its existence represents the definitive institutional response to what Edith Wilson proved was possible. One woman, without title or authority, governed the United States because the Constitution had no way to stop her. The 25th Amendment is the lock that was installed after the door was already breached. This is perhaps Edith Wilson's most paradoxical legacy. Her seizure of power, which was unconstitutional, undemocratic, and fundamentally deceptive, produced one of the most important structural reforms in the history of the American presidency. She broke the system, and the system, 47 years later, fixed itself because she had shown it was broken. Chapter 12. The question she left on the desk. On January 20th, 1961, an 88-year-old woman sat beside President Kennedy at his inauguration, and almost no one in that crowd understood what she had once been. Edith Bowling Wilson lived long enough to see the world she had shaped and the world that had moved beyond her. She was present at the Capitol on December 8, 1941, when Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan, the war that the failed League might have prevented. She witnessed the creation of the United Nations, the successor to Wilson's dream. She watched television bring the presidency into American living rooms, a technological revolution that would have made her 17-month deception physically impossible. At Kennedy's inauguration, she was seated as an honored guest, the last living link to the Wilson presidency. The young president had specifically invited her. The crowd on the National Mall saw an elderly woman in a fur coat. They did not see the woman who had read the war codes at breakfast. They did not see the woman who had fired the Secretary of State. They did not see the woman who had held the executive branch of the United States government in her hands for 17 months and answered to no one. Edith Wilson died on December 28, 1961, on what would have been Woodrow Wilson's 105th birthday. She was 89 years old. She was buried beside her husband in the Washington National Cathedral, one of only 2 presidents interred there. The proximity in death was fitting. In life, they had been inseparable, and the line between his presidency and her power had blurred until even the people closest to them could not say with certainty where one ended and the other began. Her legacy is not simple. It is not a story of triumph. It is not a story of villainy. It is a story of a woman who faced an impossible situation and made a choice that no law authorized, no precedent supported, and no institution could check. She held the line. She kept the government functioning. She prevented a constitutional crisis from becoming a constitutional collapse. And in doing so, she may have killed the League of Nations, emboldened the forces that led to the deadliest war in human history, and exposed a flaw in American democracy so fundamental that it required a constitutional amendment to repair. She did all of this with 2 semesters of formal education, a dead husband's jewelry business, and the bone-deep conviction that she knew what was best. The question she left behind is not whether she was right or wrong. History has rendered its verdict on the Treaty of Versailles. History has rendered its verdict on the concealment. The question she left behind is larger than any single decision. Edith Wilson proved that a woman could wield presidential power. She proved it completely. She proved it under crisis conditions that would have broken most men who held the office by right. She managed the executive branch during a period of labor unrest, racial violence, pandemic aftermath, and the most consequential foreign policy debate in a generation. She did this without a staff, without a title, without a single vote of confidence from anyone who had the authority to grant one. But she proved it from behind a locked door. She proved it in secret, in shadow, without accountability, without transparency, and without the consent of the governed. She proved a woman could do the job by doing it in a way that ensured no woman would ever receive credit for having done it. Her power was real, her authority was stolen, and her achievement, extraordinary as it was, could never serve as a foundation for the women who came after, because it was built on deception rather than legitimacy. The question she left on the desk, the question that outlived her by decades and outlives her still, is whether a woman can do it openly. Not from behind a locked door, but from behind the desk in the Oval Office. Not with scraps of paper that begin, "The President says," but with executive orders signed in her own name. Not as a steward, not as a shadow, not as a wife who stepped in when the system failed, but as a president, elected, inaugurated, accountable, named. Every woman who has run for that office, every woman who has governed a state, every woman who has chaired a committee or commanded a department or held the gavel in a chamber where laws are made, has carried the weight of a question that Edith Wilson asked, by answering it the wrong way. She proved the capability and undermined the cause. She demonstrated the competence and denied the right. She was the most powerful woman in the history of the American presidency, and she believed that women should not vote. The locked door is open now. The amendment she made necessary is law. The precedent she set is studied in every constitutional law seminar in the country. And the question she left behind, the question of whether a woman can hold this power, not in shadow, but in sunlight, not by accident, but by choice, not behind a locked door, but with her name on it and a nation's mandate behind her, that question is still being written into the record of a country that is not yet finished deciding what it believes about power, about women, and about who is allowed